Okay, um, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our next lecture. And a couple things we want to just go over here in terms of updates. Canvas, sorry, someone else's entire class got uploaded onto our Canvas course module. So I've been deleting everything. Hopefully in the next day I'll have all that cleaned up. It was pretty confusing. Sorry about that. Also, you should have gotten an announcement. There is a video now to show you how to upload your assignment onto the Green Morass assignment. And I've also included in that announcement a little mini tutorial, but there was not a prompt before. I've added that prompt, so sorry about that. I'd like to go ahead and do a quick Zoom meeting next Tuesday. I think we're still trying to hammer out some little nuances on the class, so I think it might be good to touch base again, and then we'll give it a break for a couple weeks. I'll also be sending you guys a Facebook invitation to a secret group for Philadelphia, a way for you to start to familiarize yourself with some of the things we've been collecting from my studio in the spring. And it is a closed group. Nobody else can see what we post and what we say in there, except for our those people from the fall studio who would like to continue on, as well as yourselves. So keep an eye for that. That should be coming soon. Okay, so today we are going to be discussing Module 2, which is a city of networks. And the philosophy around this, from my perspective, is really that we have to kind of understand how we got where we are in the U.S. So making informed decisions by understanding that not so much what happened, but how it happened and why it happened. We're going to start to see some things that have repeated. We're going to start to see how and sort of the oops, sorry about that. In the notion that yes, we are designers, we're urban designers, but the morphology and the design of cities is heavily affected by zoning and by the politics, and also, although I didn't put it in here, economics is a big piece of this as well. And I think you noticed that in some of our Green Morass. LEED is a huge industry. Well, building now is becoming a huge industry, so economics are important. We'll also be talking, at least in terms of this beginning of the morphology and the design of cities, looking at systems. Right now, really looking at rail and then looking at road as really defining the urban forms of our urban areas. So we will start with urban. We are not going to focus on rural environments in this class. We are not going to work on suburban. Some of it may come into play, but we're really going to emphasize urban. And we're really talking about those areas that are characterized by high urban population density and vast human-built features in comparison to those areas surrounding it. We'll be focusing on cities and towns, and that's important. And keep in mind that most of the world's urban population in 1950 was just 750 million people, and that has soared in the past couple decades. In 2009, the number of people living in urban areas increased from that 746 million to 3.4 billion, surpassing the number of individuals living in rural areas. So what we saw then really was that was that sort of a key point there when we hit that threshold. And that's a pretty interesting one. In 2012, China hit that threshold in terms of more people living in urban areas than in rural areas. So, the US was 2009, China 2012. So we're going to use the term morphology to really sort of talk about the built environment. I think it will be a good one as we move into sort of ecological considerations. Couple things to consider with that. And so I just pulled together some of these definitions. This is some of the material that I have had as part of my site planning classes, but thought it would be a benefit here. So we're really looking at the idea of a branch of biology that deals with the form and structure of animals and plants. And so we're looking at urban morphology in terms of how it affects people and how that then will go into and inform the idea of community engaged practice, design practice. So the form and structure of an organism or any of its parts is another component of this definition. A study and description of word formation as inflection, derivation, and compounding in language, which I think is another way that will be very helpful as we start to think about this whole idea of community design and what that really means, and particularly what it means in terms of design. Also, the system of word forming elements and processes is another interesting way to look at it. A study of structure or form, another interesting way. The external structure of rocks in relationship to the development of erosional forms or topographic features. So it's an interesting term, and I think will be helpful. And so please, I really look forward to all of you keeping it in mind, and we will continue to use it throughout the class. So this is a documentary film, a quote from that called Urbanized, and I will be putting together a annotated bibliography of some documentaries, some papers, and some videos for you guys to browse. But I think the thing that is interesting there is that he does talk about the idea that cities are always the physical manifestation of the big forces at play: economic forces, social forces, and environmental forces. And that's important because it's partly what we're going to be going through here for the next 40 or 50 minutes is sort of that timeline of when these different things happened. World War II, there's just these really, that's probably one of the bigger ones. The Depression, that's another one. All of these things affected social forces and environmental forces and have really given us the framework within which you guys are going to be landscape architects as you move forward. So, purpose today, have a little better understanding of, or a basic understanding. This is almost sort of cocktail conversation understanding of urban morphology and the influences and the history of things that have gone on. As we get into our hybrids, and each of you start to examine in greater detail some aspect of all of this that from your perspective will influence and strongly influence how you look at community engaged design, I think this information will be good for you to be able to fall back on. Okay, so 1800 AD. At that point, a young, thriving country, and we are only 5% of our population is in urban areas. We are a rural economy. We are an agrarian economy. Typically, we've got a 1 mile radius of where everything is happening. Rural areas had basically places that had general stores and resources. It was definitely agrarian and trade-based. As we move on, one of the biggest things then that does happen is the railroad, and what that does to start to change and urbanize our area becomes huge. So we have, by 1840, we have 131 U.S. towns that exceed a population of 2,500. We see the beginning of a mass transportation in the horse-drawn streetcar. But mostly and more importantly is the advent of the Transcontinental Railroad. And with the railroad comes massive migration and industrialization. Keep in mind that during that period we went from 3.5 million to 22 million. And I've included here Riverside. I'm sure that Anne has probably gone over a lot of this, and if some of this has already been included in some of your other courses, which I'm sure it has because it's such important stuff, I apologize. I will try to make sure that we have a conversation about it that is informed more by the direction that we're going in this class. So Riverside, the things that are interesting about Riverside are that its typology and its morphology really start to help us see a really interesting trend that starts to occur in trying to get my pen to go to red and it doesn't want to. I don't know why. It's in red. Okay, sorry about that. All right, so Riverside, we're talking about the late 1860s. And for those of you who don't know, Riverside is in Chicago. It was the vision of Olmsted as what he called a suburban village that was the blending of the rural countryside with urban environments, and also the development of an organizational open space. Riverside was clearly designed with no right angles anywhere. Now, I think one of the things that, of course, you're probably already saying was like, well, wait a minute, that's not really true, because if I look at this right along here, they're very strong orthogonal lines for all these homes that are along this. This is the rail line. You know, so that was really interesting in Riverside was the acceptance and acknowledgement that we had working, a lower economic, more working class, higher density along this rail line, which intersected then by our larger, more sweeping, more rural, suburban lot lines on either side. To my thinking, it was as much a part of the morphology of what Riverside was as his greens and his lawns and his very cell-like, plant-like roadway scenario. This was a time when there were more horse-drawn carriages, speeds were low and very slow, and so this kind of thing worked a bit better than with the advent of the automobile. So if we look at that just at a national perspective, 1870, this is an example of the framework Transcontinental Railroad is through, clearly in our more urbanized areas in the Northeast and the East. We see the development of a rail line system within 20 years. So that's 1870. By 1890, this rail system is massive. And a lot of that is because of the massive level of the industrialization industry, and what was going on in the East was huge. And so when we start to look at then how this affects the morphology of cities, aside from the fact that, I don't know where those strange lines came from. Sorry about that. Um, aside from the fact that we had that sort of rail configuration within cities and urbanization clustered around the rail station, with that urbanization came the City Beautiful movement. And the City Beautiful movement really stems more out of that sort of tension that occurred with the unregulated growth in inner cities, the massive immigration, poverty, child workers, just really horrific spaces. So in terms of the built environment, the idea was, well, then let's create this City Beautiful movement. Let's create these open spaces with these grand vistas and these monumental buildings, such as World's Fairs, major parkways in our cities, and that somehow the philosophy was that this beautification would promote a harmonious social order that would increase the quality of life. But then critics realized, and they would soon complain, that this movement was overly concerned with aesthetics at the expense of social reform. And Jane Jacobs, who is someone that I will be putting together some readings of hers. Good old Jane. Now everybody likes Jane again. For a long time, everyone didn't like Jane, but she's back in favor. Her description of this was a movement where architecture became a design cult. So there you have it. During the same period, again, we're still in this late 1890s, beginning of the 20th century, but not quite there yet. And there was still a reaction to the just horrible urban condition. And so what we really started to see is, and this is Garden City, Ebenezer Howard, and I know you guys have all stuttered Ebenezer Howard, but what I love is this thing up here that says, okay, we're going to give up on a group of the slum-filled, smokeless cities, and we're just going to create a new order. So Garden City was about, we're just going to kind of give up on the city because it's just such a mess. And instead, we're going to start to create these self-contained, these satellite utopian communities. And those are going to be based on kind of this central space. We're going to be radiating out, which of course works with canals and waterways and trains. And we're going to allow ourselves to have open space in between these. We're going to have lots of mass transit, and that's all going to work great. And so the thought was what we're really doing then is decentralizing these huge cities, which had become pretty much types of cesspools in terms of the quality of life. So instead of trying to really fix that morphology, let's just generate a new one. The interesting thing was that during this time, though, we're still looking at archetypes, and we're looking at morphologies that are designed by this idea that we're just going to abandon the city as we know it and create these new forms. And they were still very much driven by architectural form. The only movement during this time that didn't do this was the social reform movement. And the social, oops, sorry about that, not going to Corbu just yet. The social reform movement, see if I can write this any better, see if I get my typing better. Social reform, the only thing the social reform movement could come up with was this idea of settlement houses, which was a great idea. They started in England, similar to the way a lot of social reform did. And its main objective was the establishment of these settlement houses in poor areas. And these would be in which volunteer middle-class settlement workers would live, hoping to share knowledge and culture and alleviate the poverty of their low-income neighbors. So this was a way to really try to bring in and mix low-income poor with middle class and start to provide services like daycare, education, healthcare. This is an image in St. Louis of a settlement house and all the children that are using all of those services in there. The problem with it was an isolated event. It was not based on a morphology that moved into a community efficacy. They were isolated elements, and as such really weren't part of any kind of reform movement. Then we have Corbu, and we have the Radiant City. And I think the thing that is incredibly ironic about Corbu is that his concepts and his philosophies are all in the right place, but his architectural execution definitely suffers. And basically his whole idea was that this would be a system of urban planning where the aesthetics of habitation and efficiency and social reform would all come together. And that what we would do is we would go up so that we could have lots of open space, which is great. I mean, that's a great idea. Conceptually, he had mass transit that would bring people in. You would live and work in these little spaces so that you didn't have to travel very far. Somehow for him, this was a way to be back and be part of nature. What, of course, he didn't think about, to him, this was very much social organization. Definitely communism and China have taken on this concept if you look at a lot of the development that happened over the years there. And they assumed that by doing this, we would remove all social issues. What we did not think about is the unit, how people relate to each other. And in cities, the family unit and the neighborhood unit needs urban spaces to do that. That's not going to happen in these taller towers. But again, these were the architects' visions of how are we fixing these and highly industrialized and not very livable cities. Frank Lloyd Wright, Broad Acre, again, the same period of really trying to come up with other solutions. Frank Lloyd Wright, I'm sure most of you know again, so we'll just hit this quick. This was an agrarian approach. This was extreme decentralization that looked at every man for himself, the true sort of American way. Every person got an acre of land, and you were to be self-sufficient with your acre of land. You were to grow everything and feed yourself and take care of yourself, and then there would be these modern modes of transportation that would move you to different places, and life would be good again. Not particularly, and heavily built on democracy. So low density, almost too low. It doesn't really pencil out, as you can imagine. But the concept was to return to this sort of individualism. And what will be interesting as we continue on and we look at urban form, we will start to see how aspects of what both Frank Lloyd Wright and Corbusier and Frederick Law Olmsted all start weaving back in again into new attitudes towards urban form and design, which is why we go back and look at what all these crazy guys were doing before. So during this period, we start moving into the advent of the car, and as part of urbanization, what we start to see is instead of just rail, now we're seeing the development of a roadway system. And this is a fun little piece from 1905, which is the Good Roads map. Most people didn't know where were improved roads and where were just dirt roads that were used by horses. And so the development of an improved roadway system started to occur. And we started to see the beginning of a Office of Public Roads. And actually the first Office of Public Roads was based on or as a division of the Department of Agriculture. And it was based on that because agriculture had to find a better way to get goods into the city and didn't want to just rely on rail. At this point, it couldn't. So that's what you started to see occurring. So we have then 1893, we move into the Office of Road Inquiry, helping people understand what's going on with roads. By 1905, we have the Office of Public Roads, and we have the Federal Highway Act of 1921. And this is providing funding then, and this is where we really start to see the systems and the federal government helping create a system-wide transportation mechanism that could not have occurred by individual states. And we start to see the introduction of paved roadways. So the next big thing that we're dealing with is the Great Depression then. 1930s, the Great Depression comes, and it is instrumental in terms of urban areas because so many interurban rail systems started to fail and were leaving many cities because they no longer had suburban passenger railroads. And in this situation, it does say suburban, but really what we're talking about here is those outlying developed areas that were connected to larger cities. And that rail system was that main method of movement. And when people could no longer afford a train ticket, that all started to collide. So coinciding with that, then we see roads. We see, we see rail starting to suffer as early as the 1930s, and we see roads now improving. During the 30s, the Bureau of Roads helps states and local governments create Depression-era road projects. And here it's economic. Here it's thinking, oh, we got to employ people. Let's build roads. Let's build bridges. Let's do, all these great projects. And roads was the low-hanging fruit. So we really start seeing that shift. We also see a couple other things starting to happen as well in response to some of the issues that we have with industry. But more importantly, what we see is we see individuals trying to find ways to create a workforce. We've got to get people working again. And so what is picked to get people working then is housing. So we've got roads and we've got housing that we see starting to, and we see residential construction. And we're seeing a lot of that residential construction being in single-family homes and not necessarily in townhouses or higher density conditions. The next big move that really does start to change the framework and makeup of the American city is World War II. And a lot of things happen with World War II ending. One of the things that we see is Franklin Delano Roosevelt creating the national system of interstate highways. This Federal Highway Act, its goal is to create 40,000 miles of highway systems. Now, there is a lot of discussion around this about why it was so important. And a lot of individuals believe that with the end of World War II, you had created a huge economic base that was funding the war. And that economic base was heavily petroleum driven. You needed that for the ships, for the tanks, for the jeeps, and it was very huge. And that industry was making a lot of money, and that industry did not want to stop. that industry saw the potential with roads and highways and cars as a way to continue that business. Now, again, this is something you guys probably are all very familiar with, and was made sort of popularized in Who Framed Roger Rabbit, but that was the General Motors streetcar conspiracy. So, between 1938 and 1950, not only did you have roads being built and cars being built and cars being sold, but you had a group of businesses who were taking part in a deliberate plot to purchase and dismantle streetcar systems. And so this is a period when this was going on. They were convicted of this plot, and this plot was so that they could monopolize surface transportation. In the end, they went to trial. They were acquitted, but the story is urban legend now. It was popularized in Roger Rabbit. There are quite a few people who have continued to explore this amazing plot to basically get rid of transportation modes and move everybody into the car. Today, although I know we have light rail coming back, but for the moment, during this period, the only cities that survived this was Newark, Philadelphia, San Francisco, Pittsburgh, New Orleans, and Boston. That is the only place where streetcars remained. So, other effects as we move out of World War II. Roads are expanding. Housing had started, but now housing takes on a whole new level. The Federal Housing Act of 1949 creates the Federal Housing Authority. Mortgages are now backed by financing companies. Long-term mortgages are available. The GI Bill, suddenly the idea of the single-family home as sanctity, as something special, comes into play. And I'm sure many of you have read about Levittown as the quintessential example of this sort of mass residential redevelopment that occurred. Here's an aerial image of Levittown, the original Levittown. Clearly, the street is defining this typology. This is a typology based on well, actually, instead of me just trying to do that, we'll just go right to it. This became an archetypal American character. It was about sharing the same way of life, values, religions, beliefs, ethnicities, and living standards. And this was predominantly a white Caucasian attitude. And this is the beginning of white flight, individuals leaving cities and moving out into these suburban typologies. The mothers stay at home and take care of the kids. The husbands go into the cities and work. And a lot of that then is driven by roads. So what we also see happening now is the Federal Aid Highway Act allocates another $25 million, which in 1952 is a lot of money, to the continued development of highways that are getting people to and from where they're working to these suburban communities. And again, we're not going to spend much time on the suburban community, but Levittown and the creation of that suburb is very much intricately intertwined with what we have today in our urban cities. And I think it's important to just at least be cognizant of that if you're not already. You will be by the end of this. 1954. We see another allocation of $175 million towards this effort. And then, just in case this wasn't going to happen, Dwight Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, which really launched the interstate program, providing $25 billion. Again, $25 billion in 1956 is a disgusting amount of money. I should do the calculations, but that's just like beyond belief. 41,000 miles of highways over 21 years. And so, as you can guess, probably a lot of that money that was going towards the war effort is being channeled into this. So a couple things are happening, and I think I've used Lucy. I Love Lucy. Hopefully some of you guys have watched the old shows, but I Love Lucy in the 50s was an extremely popular comedy show. This is I Love Lucy in her apartment building in New York City, because that's what you did. You lived in the city and you had a rental unit and you lived in an apartment. Here's I Love Lucy, because even I Love Lucy towards the end of the 50s, right at the end of the show, moved to the suburbs. And that really is what's starting to show us that demographic shift, that white flight that was happening. We're even seeing it in television shows. And so I want to use here Bronx, New York City, as an example. It's an extreme example, I know, and that's why it makes a great case study. But this happened in every urban city in the United States in one way, shape, or form. But one thing before we get to that, so we get into the 60s, one of the things that happened for passenger rail was losing the railroad post office. So as soon as the post office left railroads and went to trucks as a way to move their mail, that really started to badly and damage the possibility of passenger rail systems. So what we're going to talk about now is the Cross Bronx Expressway. Any of you who have been in New York City and have experienced the Cross Bronx Expressway, which is still there, this is an image of them starting to build it. It's right there. And see all this? Well, that's all going to be gone, because this thing's just going to go right through and just obliterate this. It's just going to keep any of this from happening. And this was the brainchild of Robert Moses. So if you think about it, all of our historic old cities were built around mass transit, subway systems. They weren't built for cars, but somehow you've got to put that car somewhere, right? So let's pick our more middle class, underserved neighborhoods and just ram a major highway. Oops, not going to you yet, Jane. Ram a major highway right through the middle. And we're just going to cut off all these guys from this side. We're going to cut off everybody here. And just, we're going to do that just so that people can get from point A, which is downtown New York City, to B, which is Connecticut and all those nice suburban spaces. That's what that's for. You know, Dwight Eisenhower said, well, the regional highway system was first presented as, during the Cold War, as a military strategy, because we had to be able to get our tanks really quickly from one place to another. And so we needed roads for our tanks. And that was how a lot of it started. But what really started to happen with this is a giant pit, kind of like what people are proposing for I-70 right now, but we're not going to go there. Equally as horrific, and I can't believe we're even thinking about it in 2016, but again, we're not going to go there. Cross Bronx Expressway cut through. By doing that, some of the things that started to happen, and actually we'll get into that in a little while, the ripple effect with this was huge. One of the things that happened was the Brooklyn Dodgers leaving. So all of a sudden, major things that were a part of the city that gave jobs to everybody, that create a sense of community, were just killed by this one act. That piece, that the Cross Bronx Expressway and Robert Moses's ideas on urban renewal and bringing in the city. Jane Jacobs, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, is a great individual, a hard-nosed woman in a time when there weren't a lot of women doing this stuff, and she was an amazing person. She was, in fact, very much a proponent about these moves that we are making in urban renewal around the car and around the highway was killing communities. It was killing street safety because now suddenly everything is car oriented. The car is what everything is about, not people. We are not pedestrian oriented. We're losing our mixed use and diversity. We're losing all of those things that made our cities these wonderful places. One of the things that we will talk about later that is a new thing that's coming back is this notion that cities are about systems and about empathy. And we'll get into this more later. But if you think about that, and there's this sort of X and Y axis, having the right systems that move people, but having empathy for how we relate to each other is what's really good. And what you saw in what Robert Moses was doing was a system driven 100% with no empathy for people. This is an interesting one because this is Robert Moses's proposal for, after he was so successful with the Cross Bronx Expressway, he decided that what we really needed was yet another expressway, because really what people are trying to do is not live in Manhattan, and this is Lower Manhattan, Greenwich Village, that really people aren't trying to live in these areas. They're just trying to get from point A to B. We're not really going to do anything in here. And thanks to Jane Jacobs, who was one of the big detractors, this never happened, because Greenwich Village, as we know it now, would have never happened. So many things would have never happened because of that. And one of the things that did start to occur then at a federal level was the realization that maybe what we're doing isn't such a good idea. Now, this is the 1960s. We have not yet felt the full impact of this urban renewal, these massive highways being jammed through underserved or just moderate income, middle class neighborhoods. Most of these neighborhoods were not poor neighborhoods at the time. They were thriving middle class neighborhoods. And so in 1964, the Mass Transportation Act was created to help conserve and enhance values of existing urban areas. How do we protect them? And it goes on to talk about that our national welfare, therefore, requires the provision of good urban transportation that is properly balanced with private vehicles, and that there is some relationship between those two things. Now, while this did occur in 1964, it didn't have much teeth. And so one of the things that we can take a look at if we go back to the Bronx is this expressway went through. We had white flight. We had huge immigrant populations moving in, poor people moving in. We have a total lack of, oops, sorry, I'm going the wrong way, a total lack of jobs and economics. And so what you start to see then is urban renewal. So in the 70s, early 70s, we start to see then the creation of urban renewal, saying, all right, everything is kind of falling apart. We're going to go ahead and we're going to build these massive low-income housing projects. And yes, don't they look an awful lot like Corbu's idea, you know, for these high-rises? We're going to stick everybody up in these high-rises and everybody's going to be good and it's all going to be better. Just to add insult to injury, these projects, Co-op City, were built next to a dump, which is just really hard to believe. But all those things in the air, those are all seagulls. Because if you've ever been to a dump, there are lots of seagulls. So you can imagine what it was like to have this many people in this area. And instead of open space, they're living next to a dump. Corbu didn't really propose that in his idea. So, as a case study, cross the Bronx then by the 70s were in such economic decline that um, people were leaving, no one had jobs, buildings were starting to be burned, either for the insurance, for whatever reasons. And this in 1977, this is before the Brooklyn Dodgers left. There is a famous saying when Howard Cosell was the announcer for the 1977 World Series, and he's looking out across the Bronx, and there he sees these arsons, these fires burning in tenement buildings. And that's when he said, there it is, ladies and gentlemen, the Bronx is burning. And so it really became the epitome of urban decay. So a couple things that we start to see. We do see a complete and total decline of railroads. We do see then roads taking over. In the 70s, we see huge new proposals for suburban living. Suburban living's great. We're going to stay away from that. We're just going to continue to talk about what's going on in the inner city areas. And one of the things that did happen was at least there was some acknowledgement that we cannot lose completely rail, that we have to save it somehow, even though we're funding at outrageous amounts of dollars the highway system. But in 1970 then, we do have the Rail Passenger Service Act that created the National Railroad Passenger Corporation, which was designed to help subsidize and oversee the operation of inner city passenger trains. So again, we're trying to not lose them any more than we've already lost them, but we are. And ironically, there's the whole Rails to Trails program, which everyone thought was such a great idea because it was taking abandoned railways and making them pedestrian-oriented trails, which is a great idea, except for the fact that we really need those trains. However, so there is a great, that's a paradox for sure. We also see Urban Mass Transportation Act that further extends, is further extended in 1974 to really help with transit operating costs and construction costs, trying to keep it alive. One thing that also happens is the railroads do go bankrupt, with exception for a couple, but not many. And then the feds come in and they take it over. So for all those of you who play Monopoly, the Reading Railroad, the B&O, the Pennsylvania Railroad, all of those major railroad companies went bankrupt, and in 1971, Amtrak took them over. And that is our main inner city rail service that we have today. So a couple other things do start to happen in the 70s as well. And we're going to try to not, we're not talking about the racial and social unrest. I think it's probably clear to all of you, hopefully, that a lot of the riots, a lot of the social unrest that was happening in inner city areas was because we had moved away from an integrated social, cultural soup that was so much a part of early America. And that once that started to happen, you started to have inner city areas trying to sustain themselves without an economic base, because the taxes that came from those individuals were now out in the suburbs and they weren't in the cities anymore. And so that ripple effect continues, and we'll talk about it some more in terms of the end result of where cities get to. But from an environmental standpoint, that will start to affect infrastructure, that we'll start to talk about later. It isn't until the 1970s, 1970, and Nixon, of all people, creates the Environmental Protection Agency. Up until that time, we had laws. The first air pollution control law was in 1955. The Clean Air Act was in 1963. The Motor Vehicle Air Pollution Control Act was in 1965. The Clean Air Act amendments, again in 66, Air Quality Act in 67, the Clean Air Act extension in 70, but there was no agency. There was no watchdog to really help enforce all these regulations that were being created. So that becomes important. Other ones, for water, 1948 was the first Water Pollution Control Act. 1965 was the Water Quality Act. 1970 was the Water Quality Improvement Act. So we see these acts happening, but no one to oversee them. So EPA becomes a pretty vital strategy for how do we really kind of make sense of all of these things. In addition to that, obviously you can see as we've been talking that really what has been defining our cities has been buildings, has been rail, has been roads. Rivers, yes, rivers are very much where we have established our cities. That was the first and foremost aspect of trade and transportation was based on rivers. But we don't really see, we don't see them really from a morphology standpoint defining what's going on in our cities, in our areas. In 1972, when the Federal Water Pollution Control Act came into place, it was still more about pollution in navigable areas. It was not necessarily about stormwater runoff or that whole aspect of, as we create more and more impervious surfaces, what are we doing to our cities? Because clearly, that's what's happening. We look at cities like Philadelphia, where all of the original city's streets were cobble, they were pervious. And so when you're starting to make that shift to a pervious-driven footprint within cities, that's when people start to realize it. So it took these guys from 1978 to 1983 to conduct a nationwide urban runoff program. They did it in 28 cities, and that's when they realized, holy shit, we have a problem. Because they kept thinking that so much of the water pollution that they were seeing was coming from other sources. They were not seeing stormwater runoff as one of the biggest polluters. So that becomes a very interesting aspect. So where we are then, if we want to think about this, sorry, it's going a little crazy. We are now at, go back here. We're now at the 1980s, and what I'd like to do is leave for our second lecture the transformations that start to occur in urban areas in the 80s and 90s, what that morphology looks like, and then what starts to happen when we move into 2000 to 2010, 13, 16 to today, and the whole idea of the green movement and urbanization and the return of the pedestrian, and then a technology-driven urban environment and what that starts to do for community spaces. So we'll move into those nuances as the second half of our sort of City of Networks. My goal will be with that is to get that done sooner than later. I'm going to try to do that this week, not wait till Sunday, so that you've got both of these. But I thought you can all turn me off for a while and take a break if you want. I sure would love to do that, but I'm the one that's supposed to keep talking. At some point here, we'll we'll get this mixed media again. And sorry, I don't have any fun videos for this, but this one's just going to be more of a dry lecture. But I thought I wanted to use Maxwell Street Market as sort of a case study to leave all the things that we just sort of talked about. And it is interesting because it is, as you can see in the picture, something that has gone through the cycle of boom, decline, and then a resurgence. And I think what is interesting about it is the quality of that resurgence, but more importantly, the morphologies of what happens in terms of place and the design of the community around this. Sorry about that. Here's a couple quotes that I think are fun. These are from Reverend George Cairns. Maxwell Street is a raw and human place. It is a humble place. It is a place where people, it is a place where people, some of whom are outcasts of our society, gathered to serve one another. It is a place where Christ is found. Remember that Jesus did not dine with the elite of his society. He hung out with the outcasts. If he physically walked among us today, he would not be shopping on North Michigan Avenue. He would more likely be found on Maxwell Street. He would find the human scale, the smells and sights, the many languages and struggles engaged in the human kindness given on Maxwell Street like home. And I think it's a great description of what I think we are all searching for to bring back to communities at that human level. The market was often misunderstood by people who have never been there to walk through it. While the market was not perfect, its flaws were fixable, and they were minor compared to the gifts it bestowed. A weekly festival giving economic and spiritual sustenance to the poor. It was not the bargains, it was the people that were the attraction. So, a couple things that this case study will go through. We'll look at the location of it, the land use, the history and demographics, and we'll look at how that was formed in terms of space and place, the circulation program, vendors, patrons. I will not go into this in great detail. I will be uploading this PowerPoint. And so if you want to dive into some of the nuances in greater detail, you can do that. So, where is it located? Oops, damn, it just loves to keep doing that. Sorry about that. As you can see, it's right down here. So below downtown. It is in Chicago's near west neighborhood. It is a mile from downtown. Every Sunday, year round. And there was an old market and a new market. The old market was in a residential area. And that's what I would really like to sort of talk about. This is giving you an example of, these are the two market locations in terms of the old one and the new one. And this is some of the urban renewal that occurred within this area. And this is certainly, there is not a city in this country that has not had this kind of urban renewal happen to it. So we were talking a little bit before about the highways. Well, highway will come in again. This is the university here, very similar to our Auraria campus. These cities come in, they come into more underserved communities where they can continue to expand and through eminent domain take over. Here, this was residential. This industrial zone, which is now industrial, this is where the old one was located. It also was residential. This is where the residential is now. It's just over here. So one of the dilemmas with both the new and the old market is we've lost that connection. And that's where the new Maxwell market, this is partly where the decline of the old Maxwell market happened, and part of the frustration for residents right now with the new market. The old market, sorry, I don't know why it loves to do that. The old market began as part of the town, had very heavy immigration. It was the first market for 70 years, and consisted of vendors and push carts along this streetway. As it started to evolve in the 1950s, it started to expand in popularity. A couple things that happened, and we can kind of go back and see that. The expressway expansion and UIC's expansion really affected the ability of this market to survive. And it was in 1994 that it moved to the east and became sort of part of the campus. So if we go back again, here's where it was before. Here's its new location next to the university campus. Here's that highway expansion that really starts to cut off the residential from that area. The street that was chosen initially may have been the one that was chosen because of its width and less traveled. African Americans from the South came in, and this is where the Chicago Blues was born. And it would be considered a multicultural due to the historic nature of the different ethnic groups that were constantly moving in and out of the area. So this is a great image of really right in its heyday. You can see the activity going on. It was the first stop for many immigrants that were coming into Chicago. It became that melting pot for European Jews, Greeks, Italians, Mexicans, African Americans from the South. European Jews ran most of the shops during the early part of the market. And if we look here, and this would be, sorry about that, everybody. This would be a good example of that transition that, again, was occurring in a lot of places. And interestingly enough, we are jumping ahead here. This is just an example in the 1990s. So this is not even looking at back in the earlier days, but just the sort of the most recent white flight that was starting to happen. And what you can see is not necessarily white flight, but just sort of the demographics. So if we take a look at, I think what's more important, we do see some pretty big shifts in our poverty. Yes, it was definitely a lot of the redevelopment was affecting poverty levels, displacement of jobs. But what I like about this study is just sort of taking a look at here the lot configuration and the morphology of what is going on. And I don't know why it just loves moving forward on me like that. Sorry. Here it is in 1926. Very much our orthogonal urban street environment. The lot and block sizes are conducive for pedestrian activity and local commercial businesses. So that's working pretty well. Suddenly what we see then is the Dan Ryan Expressway right through here. So similar to the Cross Bronx Expressway, we are losing our connection to part of our community. So not only is our sort of street experience for the market smaller now, we're also having the two neighborhoods split apart and bifurcated by that. As a result, this starts to become more industrial. So then one of the things that starts to happen is um, that was bad enough, but then we end up with the university coming in, and it starts buying and purchasing and redeveloping areas. So it starts buying up whole blocks, and so then we're kind of down to just reorienting it to have this little piece here. So then we can really start to, why it's doing that. So then we really start to see the changing of these lot configurations. I must have put a timer on these. It's all I can think of. Now we really start to see, by 1996, given everything that's going on, we have to change its location because it's just completely immersed in industrial and the city. So it does get relocated, which is in an industrial area. But the concession there was, well, it's in an industrial area now. We can use the industrial parking lots, and that will work great for everybody coming in because now we're going to attract lots of white people in cars. So you end up with, a couple problems. You do have two major interstates that it's located near. That's great. You do have two elevated trains. You do have parking. But ironically, one of the things that happened is that we've lost a lot of the qualities of what it was before. We've lost, sorry, I don't know why it just keeps doing that. It's going to make me throw up here soon. The old market would spill out into the streets. Goods were typically sold by residents and driven to the site by vans. So there was a very pedestrian quality about it. It was very much about the community. The kinds of goods that it sold were produce, antiques, clothing goods, musicians, mimes, music. So it definitely had a very strong cultural flavor. Now currently, the new market does have, I'm going to try disconnecting that, see if that helps us at all. The new market does have 480 local and international vendors. It's doing well. It is surviving. And that's the good news out of this whole thing. And so that's great to know. The current market, the current street market in 1993 had an amazing percentage of a mix of vendors selling all kinds of things. And it was a big boom to everything that was going on. So I think it's a great testimony to, and here you can kind of see it's out in this industrial area. It's got plenty of parking. It certainly doesn't have that feel that we saw in those earlier photographs of being part of a community ethos. It's a little bit more like the Mile High Flea Market. For those of you who have been to that in Denver, if you haven't, you ought to. It's pretty interesting. So the patrons, on the other hand, sorry about that. What do we see between vendors versus neighborhood demographics? And so there is some disparity between those. Is that bad? I don't know. Um, you know, where it is now, it would be interesting to take a look. This, I think this really was looking at sort of 1993. I'll do a little investigation to see. Um, I'm scared to see because I'm afraid to find out that it's completely gone, which wouldn't be unusual. But I do think it's interesting to be able to take a look at that in terms of that immediate shift that we saw from 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. Here is that one solution trying to save a market um, and seeing it survive. A couple interesting things about it. A couple interesting things about it. The old market um, did have a market master who did have fees and would run the market. By the 1970s, this was Chicago, and so that was eliminated due to graft and corruption. When they removed the market master, for a while there, it was a first come, first serve then, and they just were kind of working on their own. The new market now is completely run by the City of Chicago's Special Events Division. So it does have a little bit more structure to it, and is certainly marketed by the city as an original Chicago tradition fun for the whole family. So I think in closing, I think a couple things, and maybe this is being critical, but the new market has been criticized. It's been criticized because it's too small. It only has half the slots for vendors that the old market did. Vendor fees have increased, so now it's becoming too expensive for some of the local mom and pop vendors that it used to have. Is it starting to gentrify then and becoming a little bit more high end? The new location is also too distant from what made it work before, and that was the neighborhood. So we were talking a little bit about that sort of neighborhood ethos and the qualities that made it special was the fact that it was in the heart of the neighborhood. It's lost that. It doesn't incorporate any of the history that the old location was proud of, which is really too bad. And because of low traffic earnings of vendors who made the move, when you only have half the number of vendors, you start to lose a lot of things that are going on. Couple things about it. Relational concepts, and these are some of the things that we'll be talking about when we really start to think about community engaged design. And this one, the expansion or problem, what do you do, and do you capitalize on the student campus town concept? And this is an issue in every city as universities begin to expand in incredible numbers, although I think we have probably seen the bubble of that, and we're probably on top of that bell curve. But it is something that we start to look at is what is the diversity in terms of the neighborhood. How do you rally a community around a market? How do you really get that to work? What is the market in terms of the community? And demographics in terms of patrons who are neighborhood residents and how that starts to work. And I think that's one of the things that when we start to look at community engaged design, we start to look at the current typologies that are trying to decentralize and to be more community engaged as we see that shift from the great shopping mall and the big box to more intimate community engagement, which is the trends that we'll start to see. That all becomes really interesting in terms of how do you sustain that. And I think so. Sort of the last thing on this market was that whole idea about the neighborhood or the idea of market, the neighborhood or the idea of school. Um, the neighborhood market, is the site sufficient? What are those nuances? Where do schools go? How do we make schools be a market, a hub? Is the site big enough to be able to handle some of those things? So I think what was interesting with this is a case study is um, we're going to be turning upside down the notion of a school as community school, as community space. Um, and part of that has to be the comings and goings and people and converging there and having flea markets and having farmers markets and a microcosm of this larger study. But it will be interesting when we start to really look at what are some of these influences and how do we start to make these connections as we move forward. And there's sources if you guys are more interested in aspects of the city that market in particular. So what we will do then, our next lecture, will start to look at urban morphologies in the 80s and 90s. Those will be interesting in terms of some of the movements, Peter Calthorpe, urbanism, the pedestrian magic quarter-mile walk, the resurgence of sort of the car taking second place to people, but does it really? So we'll start to look at some of those movements in that context and things that started to happen and what worked and didn't work with those. And then moving into 2000, connecting with greening and technology and how those have really started to transform the urban morphology and will continue to. Technology will probably take a look at a little bit of what Panasonic has been starting to do in terms of smart towns, since it is a movement and it does have a morphological presence, at least if you look at Fujisawa as an example. So we will probably just stick our toe in the water on that just because it's just so new and out there and interesting. So with that, thank you, everybody.